And former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster is out with a sobering assessment of his time serving in the Trump White House, offering a staunch condemnation of his former boss. In his new book, which bears the title, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House, McMaster depicts the current Republican presidential nominee as an insecure personality whose need for flattery and approval made him an easy target of foreign adversaries bent on weakening the United States. McMaster served as Trump's national security advisor for 13 months until he was fired in 2018. And retired Army and Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster joins us now. Thank you for being here, sir. Congrats on the book. Let's start with simply what we said before the break. The Trump campaign has pushed back on this. They said the book should be assigned to the bargain bin of fiction, suggesting that nothing in it there is worth paying attention to. But talk to us about what we can find in this book, your day-to-day experiences in his White House.
Sure. Well, hey, I think it's a missed opportunity for the Trump campaign because, there's a lot positive about President Trump in here, especially about his disruptive nature. And my observation, as having been on the receiving end of a lot of policies and strategies developed in Washington that made no sense to me overseas when I was serving in Kabul and in Baghdad, and Trump disrupted a lot of what needed to be disruptive. But the story in the book is also about how he's so disruptive that he disrupts himself and he becomes the antagonist in his own story. So this is not, this is not a warning about President Trump. This is informing readers about the president's character and personality, how that interacts with the real challenges that we faced, all of which are live issues today, from the competition with China and Russia, Iran's aggression and use of this axis of aggressors in the Middle East and the threat from North Korea. I mean, you can go on, Venezuela, all of the issues that we're confronting today, we confronted in that first year of the Trump administration. And this is mainly a story about how I was trying to help a disruptive president disrupt what needed to be disrupted.
So one of the themes in the book is how Trump's inexperience and hubris and susceptibility to flattery, in your estimation, really weakened U.S. national security or position on the world stage, and no more so than with Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. As you saw it up close, what do you think that was? Can you explain the nature of that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I really tried hard to explain. In the book, I say, at one point I came home and I said to my wife, hey, I can't figure this out, but here's how I see it. I see that in some ways there's a lot of continuity between George W. Bush and his initial approach to Putin and Barack Obama and his initial approach to Putin. Both of them were very hopeful that, hey, I'm the one who can establish a better relationship. I can convince him that, hey, his future is with the West. It's with Europe. It's not, and maybe ameliorate his behavior and so forth. Trump was under that same delusion. He thought, because he has great confidence in his own ability to, make a big deal with somebody. And what I tell the story in the book about is that, hey, I would tell him, hey, this is the best liar in the world, right? He has aspirations. He has objectives in mind that go far beyond anything in relation to us. And so we can't try to placate Putin. Well, the only thing that Putin respects is strength, and so one of the chapter titles here is Weakness is Provocative. And one of the stories in that chapter is my interaction with President Trump, showing him on a big chart that I put in front of him in the back room of the Oval Office, in the little dining room there. And on the bottom of it were world events, U.S. actions that portrayed a sense of weakness or irresolution. And on the top of it, just following that, was an act of Russian aggression, whether it was denial of service cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007, or the invasion of Georgia in 2008, or the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And the point I was making is, Mr. President, don't trade off something for Putin to hope that you can have a better relationship. Act with strength. And that's when he authorized the sale and provision of Javelin weapon systems, to the Ukrainians. So a lot of the book is my story of thinking, what was it like? What was it like to serve in the Trump White House? And it was really our team's effort to help a disruptive president, disrupt what needed to be disrupted.
It's a pretty stark assessment of some of his foreign policy decisions and from your time in the White House. But let's also think about what's happened since then. You mentioned aid to Ukraine. Well, he was later impeached over aid to Ukraine because he held it back. You have seen his comments about Kim Jong-un. You have seen his continued flattery about Vladimir Putin. You saw January 6th. So putting this all together, it's not just that Donald Trump was president. He's trying to be president again.
Yeah.
Do you really think that America's national security interests would be served by another Donald Trump term?
Well, I think that's for every voter to decide.
But what do you think?
What you're saying, Jonathan, what I'm saying is, how do you strike the balance, right, between somebody who does disrupt, some of the policies in Washington, and I think a lot of people would agree that there's a lot of Washington that needs to be disrupted, but also be cognizant of the inconsistency of the president. You mentioned a number of examples. One of the other examples in the book is how I think President Trump put into place for the first time a really reasoned and sustainable approach to Afghanistan, but then abandoned that, right? And entered into negotiations with the Taliban without the Afghan government present. He recreated, I think, a lot of the same problems of the Obama administration in the approach to Afghanistan. So, hey, I think, Jonathan, that's for you and Richard, every individual voter to say, okay, based on what you learned in this book, you make your own decision. I'm not here to, as a washed-up general, to tell people how to vote.
Well, let me ask you about one individual voter. You.
Yeah.
You have said you wouldn't serve in a Trump term. Are you going to vote for him? Well,
I'm not going to answer that question, Jonathan. Here's, and I tell the story in the book, right? I took the oath of service at age 17 on the plane at West Point, and I followed George Marshall's example, who had been one of my heroes. I'd read, youth biographies of him and everything, and I think it's really important to have a bold line between the military, even retired military, and partisan politics. Not politics in terms of political competitions and diplomacy and national security affairs, but I just don't want to. I don't think any American needs an old general to tell them how to vote. So. I was somebody, my editor actually, who's a great guy. He said, this book needs to be a warning. I'm like, no. I want this book to inform, not to warn. That's the purpose of the book.
Hey, Chuck, can you tell us about the time where when President Trump felt really strongly about an issue? You said, Mr. President, here's why I don't think you got it quite right. I think you ought to think X, not Y. And he said, good point. I'll change my mind. Do you have examples where he's open to doing that?
Yeah, there are many examples in the book of exactly that. And so I think it's sometimes people took kind of the wrong approach with Donald Trump, right? So I think there are three types of people. Richard, you can confirm or deny this, right? In any administration, there are people who are there to serve the elected president, to recognize, hey, this is the president who got elected, and what my duty is to give that president best analysis, give that president multiple options, and let him or her decide, what the course of action is. There's a second group of people. They're not there to give the president multiple options. They're there to manipulate decisions based on their own agenda, right? And then there's a third group of people who think it's their job to protect the country and maybe the world from the president. The problem with the second and third groups is, hey, nobody elected them. And if in our country sovereignty lies with the people, they're actually undermining the Constitution, right? Because they're unaccountable appointed officials. So I saw it as my job to be, and this is one of the chapter titles in here, the guardian of Trump's independence of judgment. And I think we were effective, for a time. I got used up, I only lasted 13 months there, but, it was effective to give him multiple options and to start with, hey, Mr. President, I think this is your preferred course of action. But if these are our goals and objectives, and we always would have a discussion first, hey, what is it we're trying to achieve? Maybe we should consider something else. And then he would evolve his thinking over time.
You have an unbelievably distinguished military background. Did you have serious conversations with him about the use of the American military on U.S. soil? Did you ever sit down with him and talk about the Insurrection Act and the costs of potentially using the U.S. military at home?
I didn't. I was gone by that time, right? But Richard, by the time of all the George Floyd's murder, the violent aftermath of that, all of that. So I did make a few phone calls, and I think at times, like everything else, right? The title is At War with Ourselves, because we are at war with ourselves. Okay. And one of the themes is, hey, that's not only bad for our psyche, right? It's bad for governance. And it's bad for our confidence in who we are as a people, and confidence, as you were talking in the earlier segment, in our democratic institutions and processes. So I think what I hope the book does is help us realize, hey, we all have a stake in arresting these centripetal forces that are just tearing us apart from each other. I tell a lot of stories in here about, how Trump, says things that are inflammatory, says things that are disrespectful, offensive. But oftentimes the response to what Donald Trump says or does is as bad or worse than him. And so, hey, let's stop this vortex of vitriol, and get to what we can agree on, which is a lot. And so I did make a few calls in that period of time and said, hey, this is, I think, what the president should say. Of course, I mean, I don't know if it got to him or not. Certainly he didn't say those things that I think could have brought Americans together around more of a consensus. Hey, would it be right to activate the military to stop people from burning down people's businesses in Portland or Seattle? Yes. Yeah, that would make sense. But the way it was portrayed, was just even more divisive.
Well, Trump certainly chose the path of divisiveness repeatedly, Caddy. And one of the defining relationships, there's Putin, of course, but another defining foreign policy relationship for Donald Trump, which is discussed at length in this book, is with Xi Jinping of China.
Yeah, and of course it's his relationship with China and the pivoting of that relationship that UHR say is one of the better things that Donald Trump does. And you write about a meeting between then President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping, quote, "As Trump began to speak, I experienced a wave of apprehension that caused a sinking feeling in my stomach. The president agreed with Xi that military exercises with South Korea were provocative and went on to describe them as a waste of money. Even worse, he seemed to agree with Xi's suggestion of a return of freeze for freeze. Trump did not refer to the talking points I had given him on the top issues of Taiwan, the South China Sea and the Senkakus. His response to Xi's complaints about all three gave the impression of U.S. ambivalence over countering People's Liberation Army aggression across the region. Just when I thought it could get no worse, Trump offered to mediate on the Senkakus, implying that China had a legitimate claim to be adjudicated. I passed White House Chief of Staff John Kelly a folded note. Xi ate our lunch. Trump walked into the trap." It's a great scene, and there are many great scenes in the book, HR. When you look at a possible second Trump administration, what have we learned from the first one, and who do you think there could be that could play the kind of, harnessing of the disruptive nature of the president that you tried to play in the first administration?
Well, Caddy, it does matter, who's around the president, and we hope the president would appoint good people. I think there are a lot of good people waiting.
Do you think he will?
I think in confirmable positions, yes. I mean, I know that there are some good people waiting to come to help any president. One of the themes in the book, Caddy, is like, hey, listen, I mean, I served in the Trump administration, and this is not a woe is me book. I mean, I was grateful for the opportunity to help the elected president. This was my sixth commander in chief that I'd served under as a military officer. So I hope that good Americans who can make a difference in any administration volunteer to serve, whether it's in uniform, as a diplomat, as an intelligence official. We need the best young Americans to serve our nation at this critical moment, which Richard has written about in the recent Foreign Affairs. It's a really critical moment in history for us. And so I hope that's the theme, Caddy. And, of course, the Donald Trump portray in that meeting with Xi Jinping, that's probably not going to surprise a lot of Americans, right? I mean, he does, say what's without filter a lot of times. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes that's arresting. Sometimes that is damaging. It just depends on, on what's on his mind at the time. But I hope that the main, the main thrust of the book and kind of the tenor of the book is that, hey, it was a privilege to serve. This is a complicated picture like it is within any administration. And I hope Americans learn, hey, what it was like. I mean, I think it's in many cases like that story and others. I mean, there are stories that I think are insightful in terms of the president's character, personality, and how he interacted with the challenges that we're still facing today. And Caddy, that's, as you alluded to, that's one of the big elements of continuity between the Trump and Biden administrations. I mean, I think there's really very little daylight
100%.
On the need to compete with China, China's military aggression in the South China Sea that we're seeing,
for sure,
but also the weaponization of their statist mercantilist economic model against us.